Okay, I'll try and make that happen. So yeah, happy to be here and talk to you about some of the work we've been doing on the effects of repetition on belief. So in one of his fireside chats, Franklin Roosevelt once said that repetition does not transform a lie into a truth. And what I'm going to be talking about today is all the ways that he's actually wrong. While repetition can't actually change the ground truth of information, it can't make a lie into truth, it can change how people think about false information, and it can make them more believable. So we've got 40 years of evidence now that repetition does increase the perceived truth of statements. And it does so even if you have prior knowledge. So among people who know that the Cyclops is a legendary one-eyed giant in Greek mythology, when you have them read the Minotaur is the legendary one-eyed giant in Greek mythology twice, they're more likely to think that that statement is true than when they've only heard it once. We've done a number of experiments looking at this. I'm going to walk through just one of them so you get a sense of what we typically do. So in this study, participants started with a knowledge check. So they answered a series of multiple choice questions like, what's the name of the one-eyed giant in Greek mythology? Answer choices were Cyclops, Minotaur, or I don't know. So it's always the correct answer, the answer we use in the false statement, or I don't know. And that allows us to sort statements into two different categories. The things that you do have prior knowledge on, you got it correct in that knowledge check, and the things that you don't have prior knowledge on, the things you either got wrong or you said, I don't know. Then at least 2 weeks later, participants return for this exposure phase and truth phase. In the exposure phase, you see a bunch of these true and false trivia facts. You rate how interesting they are. Then in the truth phase, you rate another set of facts, now rating their truth from definitely false to definitely true. And the key thing is that in this truth phase, half of the statements are repeated from that exposure phase. What we find first for the unknown falsehoods, these are false statements that when you answered the question on the knowledge check, you either got it wrong or said, I don't know. So you don't have prior knowledge there. And what you see is this typical illusory truth effect, this typical effect of repetition, where the repeated statements, the ones you saw in the exposure phase and the truth phase, are given higher truth ratings than the new statements. What's really interesting is you get that exact same pattern for these known falsehoods. So these are just questions that they got correct 2 weeks earlier. Now when they're reading the false statement twice, they still think it's more likely to be true. It's important to note that participants aren't ignoring their prior knowledge, so they do rate these known falsehoods as being less true than the unknown falsehoods. So they're using their prior knowledge, they're just also relying on repetition as a cue. But the work I want to talk about today is some research we've been doing trying to look at this in more naturalistic settings. So we've got over 40 years of research on the illusory truth effect, but we don't know much about how it works outside of lab contexts. So we had two main goals with these studies. The first was to look at the effect of larger numbers of repetitions. So rather than just looking at you saw it once or twice, or maybe 3 times, what happens if you've seen it 8 times, 16 times? And then the second goal was to have a much more naturalistic presentation. So rather than the repetitions happening within a survey experiment or within a laboratory session, we actually texted people these true and false trivia statements. So they got them within their daily life, this more naturalistic exposure spread out across many days. And we wanted to see if we still saw these effects of repetition. So what we did, we took true and false, relatively unknown trivia statements. Participants signed up and agreed to receive 5 text messages from us every day for 15 days. So that served as the exposure phase. The text messages looked something like this. You'd have the statement, Bullet was the name of Roy Rogers' dog, and we asked participants to respond with how interested are you in this statement? 1 low, 6 high. Then on day 16, everybody answered a final survey. This served as our truth phase, where they rated the truth of these statements from 1 definitely false to 6 definitely true. We had 10 key headlines that were counterbalanced across participants so that they saw them either once, they only happened on that final survey, they saw them twice, once during the exposure phase, once during the truth, 4, 8, or 16 times. So for the statements, they saw 16 times, they got a text message with it every day for 15 days, and then saw it again in the final survey. This is what we found. So this is the number of views on the x-axis and then mean truth ratings on the y for both true and false statements. And you can see this kind of logarithmic pattern of results here, where initial repetitions are having a larger increase, a larger effect on truth ratings than our later repetitions, but we're still seeing a slight increase even between 8 and 16 views. For the stats, we transformed everything to the log number of views, which just confirms that that is a logarithmic function. It looks pretty nice straight line here. We ran a mixed model with random intercepts for both statement and participant, and along with effects of both repetition and truth in their interaction. And what you find is that kind of an increase in 1 natural log unit of the number of views corresponds with a 1/4 point increase in the statement's truth rating. So on that 6-point scale, each log number of views is increasing truth ratings by about a 1/4 point. This very nicely replicates a laboratory experiment that was being run at the same time by Sarah Barber and her student. They also were interested in the facts of large numbers of repetitions, but they did it in kind of a single session lab study where you just saw the statements multiple times. And you can see a very similar logarithmic pattern happening there in their experiments. So this is some evidence both for the shape of the illusory truth curve. So repetition is affecting belief in this logarithmic manner. And then also that it happens in daily settings. So even when you're getting the repetition in your daily life, rather than in this artificial lab setting, you're still seeing these effects of repetition. But you may have noticed that despite me saying we were going to more naturalistic settings, we still use these kind of boring trivia facts that people might not care about very much. So we also replicated the study, this time using true and false health-related headlines that had been fact-checked by Snopes. So if you're not familiar, Snopes is an online fact-checking website. They tend to check more salacious rumors and things that are going viral on the internet. So they tend to be kind of a little more bizarre than what you might see on other websites. So just some samples. We ended up with true headlines like rare brain-eating amoebas killed Seattle woman who rinsed her sinuses with tap water. And false headlines like young blood could be the secret to long-lasting health. So we used these true and false headlines in that exact same texting paradigm. So again, participants are getting text messages with these headlines, responding with how interested they are in them, and then taking the final survey on day 16. And we get very different results. So there is a significant effect of repetition here, but as you can see, it's way smaller than what we saw in the previous study. So here, an increase in 1 natural logarithmic unit of the number of views corresponds with a 0.04 increase in the statement's truth rating versus 0.25 with the trivia facts before. Just as an aside, this was pretty shocking to us. I've spent the past 5 years talking about how repetition affects belief for everyone in every situation, no matter what prior knowledge you have, kind of in the rain, on a train, wherever it is. But we found these materials where we're getting a much smaller effect. We also have recently done another replication, this time using corporate wrongdoings. This was a collaboration with Daniel Efron, who's a morality psychologist and is interested in how repetition affects moral judgments. So we got both truth ratings and evaluations of morality. So these corporate wrongdoings are things like a flight attendant slapped a 7-month-old baby in the face for crying during a flight. Exact same texting paradigm. And now we see something that's kind of in the middle. So we do get an effect of repetition. It's smaller than what we saw with trivia, but bigger than with Snopes. So here it's 1.4 point increase on this 100-point scale, which when you convert it to the 6-point scale is like 0.08. So just to kind of compare across the three samples, we've got these trivia statements where you get this large effect of repetition, these Snopes health headlines where we got a much smaller effect, and the corporate wrongdoings, which are somewhere in between. So what we decided to do was take everything back to the lab into our more controlled setting and look at how these different types of statements might affect belief. So what participants did was either saw trivia statements, these Snopes health-related headlines, or we also used a set of political true and false headlines. These were things that Rand and Pennycook had found had an effect of repetition in earlier studies. The idea was that the political headlines might be more similar to the Snopes because they're headlines, but they're also not quite as bizarre as the Snopes. This is one where we did 80 items, so we've got pretty precise measures. We also did it with 20 items. But the idea is basically to see, is this something that happens with all of the types of items from this category, or is there something strange about the 10 or 20 items we had in that texting study? So here's the results for trivia. So you get a nice large effect of repetition on belief. Political headlines, you get kind of this smaller but still significant effect. It's fairly similar to the effect of 0.24 from the Rand and Pennycook study. And for these Snopes headlines, you see the smallest effect size, although it's not significantly different than the political. So there does seem to be some difference in the effect of repetition on belief, depending on the type of statement. So what my graduate student Ronak Pillai is looking at now is, what is it about these statements that makes repetition have a larger or smaller effect? So we did a survey experiment where participants rated these statements on a bunch of different variables, trying to see which ones predict the size of the illusory truth effect for that statement. Preliminary evidence is that the two things that seem to matter are bizarreness. So the more bizarre a statement is, the less repetition affects belief, and also relevance to daily life or relevance to health. So the more relevant it is to you, the less of an effect repetition has on belief. And so we're doing studies right now trying to see if what happens is maybe that relevance or bizarreness serves as a cue to get you to actually use your prior knowledge rather than rely on this heuristic of repetition. So we're checking to see if we speed people up and put them under working memory load, will this effect of repetition reappear? Because now you can't use those more effortful cues. So across these studies, we find that repetition does affect belief in real world settings, but the size of the effect varies with the materials presented. So there's something important going on with the type of statement. I want to talk you through one other study we've done looking at kind of more naturalistic repetitions of things. So during his time in office, President Trump made 30,573 false claims, according to the Washington Post fact checker. Many of those he repeated multiple times. So 8 of those statements he repeated over 200 times each, including his favorite statement, "We built the greatest economy in the history of the world," which he repeated almost every other day. So in this study, we're interested in looking at kind of, do these repetitions of false claims by political elites impact public opinion? And there's obvious reasons to think that they might, based on the studies I presented earlier and these effects of repetitions on belief. But in this case, Trump's repetitions would have been separated by weeks or months rather than just a few days or minutes. They're repeated with much different phrasing. So when he says the same idea twice, he doesn't repeat the exact same statement twice. He just repeats the general idea. And these repetitions are also happening in a very high choice media environment. And we know that availability doesn't necessarily mean exposure. So just because Trump said it 10 times doesn't mean that the people in our study actually heard it 10 times. So for this experiment, we used the Washington Post fact checker database. So they kept track of Trump's false and misleading claims during his presidency. They then released the database of all of those claims, which has some very nice features. They kept track of the category of the claim, kind of what the topic was. Important for our purposes, they kept track of if it was linked to other claims, if it was a repetition of something he'd already said and how many times that had been repeated. And they also kept track of the location of the claim. So did it happen on Twitter, in a rally, in an interview, etc. So we took all of these claims and ended up selecting 150 statements. Those came from 5 different bins of repetition. So we took some that he had only said once, and then others from each quartile of repetition. So things he had said 2 to 3 times, 4 to 9, 10 to 24, or 25 or more times. The statements came from the top 5 categories: coronavirus, economy, election, foreign policy, and immigration. And so we chose 6 statements of each of those cells to create our 150. These are things like, as of August 2020, only 6% of the people reported to have died from COVID-19 had actually died from COVID-19. A coronavirus one, he said once. Hillary Clinton laundered money to the DNC during the 2016 presidential election, something he said 2 times. Trump administration tested border wall prototypes to ensure they were resistant to climbing by world-class mountain climbers. Immigration one 5 times, also one of my favorites. Around 10,000 manufacturing plants opened during the beginning of the Trump administration. So economy related 15 times. And one of his favorites, when Trump entered office, the US military was completely out of ammunition, something he said 49 times. So you can see we've kind of rephrased the statements to make them more kind of bland statements of fact. We removed the kind of Trump phrasing out of them. And we also did not tell participants that these specifically came from Trump. So in our survey, we had about 750 US residents. We sampled, so 300 of them would be Republican, so that we could match the most recent AIM survey that 40% of US residents are Republican. Participants saw 5 pages in the survey. Each page had 4 of these randomly selected false claims that they rated on the scale from definitely false to definitely true, along with 1 true claim. So we did have 10 filler claims, 2 from each category that were things Trump said that were true. Participants, like I said, weren't told they were from Trump, and were just asked to rate the accuracy of each of these statements. Then at the end of the survey, we got some media consumption and demographics. So party ID, political interest, TV news consumption. So they saw a list of programs and had to check all that they watched at least once a month. The simplest way to look at the data is just for each statement, look at how many times Trump said it and how much people thought it was true. So here we've rescaled our truth ratings from 0 to 1, just for ease of analysis. And then the x-axis is, again, that log of repetition, since we know that the effect between repetition and truth is logarithmic. And what you find overall is the smallest correlation I've ever managed to create. So this is an R of 0.002. So if you look at all participants across all statements, there is no effect of repetition on belief, but that's obviously hiding a lot of differences in media consumption and party ID and things like that. So quickly, here's the correlation matrix. I want you to focus your attention on this first column, which is what is correlated with the overall truth rating. So that percent Fox News is of the TV news programs you watch, what proportion of them are Fox shows? So how much of your media diet is Fox dominated? That was a very strong predictor of belief in these Trump falsehoods. Whereas how much of your news diet is MSNBC was a negative predictor. You also see a very strong effect of party ID, where Republicans are way more likely to believe these statements than are Democrats. The really interesting analyses are these OLS regressions. We did them with clustered standard errors for each participant. In model 1, we have some statement level characteristics. So this is the number of repetitions, and also the proportion of the repetitions that were made on Twitter. I'll talk about why I think that's important. Demographics, age, gender, race, ethnicity, education, news consumption. So this proportion of TV news that was Fox, the proportion MSNBC, total TV news, and also if you were a Twitter news consumer. And then finally, these measures of politics, party ID, and political interest. We ran the model 3 times, once with all participants, once with just Democrats, once with just Republicans. Model 2 was exactly the same, plus some interesting interactions. So we were interested in how the effects of repetition might interact with these TV news diet factors, and also Twitter, the repetitions on being on Twitter.
Sorry, Lisa, that's repetitions of the specific claim?
Yeah, so of all of the claims, of all of the repetitions of that claim, what % of them were made on Twitter?
Thanks.
Yep. So this is model 1. I can come back to it in questions, but I want to zoom in on the interesting finding. And Carla, I've got 2 minutes. I will wrap up, I promise. So the number of repetitions overall, very small effect. But if you switch between Democrats and Republicans, you see very different effects. So for Republicans, there is a significant effect of repetition on belief, where the statements that Trump said more often are more likely to be believed. For Democrats, you get the negative effect. So more repetitions is actually leading to less belief. When you add in those interactions, there's 2 interesting things. First one is that repetitions have a larger effect if the TV news diet is mostly Fox. So if you're watching a lot of Fox News, those repetitions have a larger effect on your beliefs than if you're watching less Fox News. And repetitions also had a larger effect if they occurred on Twitter. So things that Trump said mostly on Twitter, those repetitions were more potent than things that he said in other locations. Reason we think that is because we think TV news is amplifying the things that Trump says on Twitter. So we did an analysis with the Stanford Cable TV News Analyzer, looking for times that Donald Trump's face was on the screen while the transcript said kind of these different locations he might have given the remarks. And you can see that there's many, many more seconds of cable news coverage for tweet or Twitter than for these other locations. So Trump's repetitions did influence public beliefs, but moderated by media environment and exposure. So overall, repetition increases perceived truth, even when statements contradict prior knowledge. Effects hold in everyday settings, but are diminished for these more bizarre statements. And repetition by political elites may also affect belief, but moderated by exposure and media diet. All right, I'll wrap up there. Thank you. All right, David was quick with the hand.
Sorry, it's super cool stuff. So I got a few things that I'll try to, like, one question is, I would have thought that the stuff that, okay, so the claims that he made on Twitter were covered more in the media, but doesn't that suggest that it means that they're claims that people would have had more prior exposure to, which your other stuff would suggest then you should get less of a new exposure effect if they've already seen it before?
Yeah, but also, I mean, I think they're just things that are going to be repeated so much more often than the other things. Like some of these are things that he only said once or twice. And if he said it once in a rally and no one reported on it, then it's unlikely to really affect public opinion.
So you think it's just selecting for claims that are impactful in some sense?
A little bit. So Trump was so responsive to what his audience thought that it's unclear if what's happening here is that repetition is increasing belief, or if Trump is repeating things more that the public already likes and wants to believe. And
I thought it was I thought it was interacting with your exposure thing. It was just a main effect.
No, it is. So it is interacting with these percent Twitters, and it's interacting with the Fox News diet. So there does seem to be something going on here, but it is a correlational study that there could be other things going on too.
Interesting.
Right.
And
so the participants in the room, the online participants don't see the hands in the room, so please wait until I give you the word. But did you have a follow-up, David?
Yeah, but if other people have questions, I can yield my time.
All right. Yes, Simona has a question?
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Very interesting. I'm working on true by repetition effect myself. And what I disagree on is the fact that it is not true for everyone that repetition increases truth. In the last 2 years, there has been studies showing that for at least 20% of participants in studies, you have the opposite effect. And I also found myself that instructor repetition is enough to increase truth. But I also found that I had 40% of my sample showing the reverse effect. I wonder whether you measure that in your studies and what you found with that respect.
I mean, we definitely see variability where some people show more than others. I don't have the graph here that you can actually see that. I've never seen 40%, but I do think kind of 10 to 20% showing reverse effect is clear. I'm really interested in if that's a stable individual difference or if it's just noise. I know you guys are kind of working on that. So I'm interested to see what comes out of it.
So next is Stefan.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I have a question about the bizarreness effect earlier, and you conjectured some ideas why that might happen, that it's maybe kind of almost like attention-driven or violation expectations. And I was wondering how this relates to other research that's kind of same but different. So I was thinking both on classic work by science on the mere exposure effect, which is not about truth, but about familiarity and liking, which I thought that it showed that if the more incidental it is, the bigger the mere exposure effect was. And then there's also this research from people like Michael Wenke, Norbert Schwarz, and others on, I forgot the other name, Jacobi maybe, on misattribution of fluency and other things. So I was wondering how this finding relates to these other phenomena that are different, but maybe still relevant.
Yeah, it's interesting because you could make the claim that kind of these more bizarre ones, you're more likely to notice the repetition. And so maybe that's why repetition's having less of an effect, because when you don't notice it is when it might have a larger effect. Although I don't think that kind of knowledge of the repetition plays as large of an effect here as it does in kind of those misattribution of fluency things. But it's definitely something we're interested in figuring out, and we're trying to look at, is this something that's happening at encoding, which would be something that's happening kind of on that first exposure, as in what you're hypothesizing, or is it something that's happening when you're making the truth rating in the second phase? And we don't know yet.
And then Maria.
In your findings, was there a difference between increased perception of truth when repetition was by the same person or some same media outlet versus cases where the repetition was spread around and people were getting repeated false information from different sources?
Check back in 3 months. We're designing that study right now. So we just did a study looking at, we used news headlines where they were all talking about the same story, but the headlines themselves were different, and looked at what happens if you see 3 headlines, kind of 4 different headlines that all are on the same story, or the same headline 4 times. Both of those increase truth by similar amounts, which is a little surprising if you think that these effects are just purely fluency based. In that case, the 4 identical repetitions should have a much larger effect. And what we're about to do is kind of have an obvious source cue so that the 4 paraphrases are coming from 4 different people or from the same person, and to try and look at how those source things interact.
Any really quick question? No, okay.
I have a question about whether you are aware of, I mean, have you tested whether the inclusion of new statements, so if I understood correctly, in some of your studies, you included new statements, in other it was just comparison of the same old statements over repetitions. Are you aware whether the inclusion of new statements in the paradigm affects, and I think this question is relevant when it comes to the fluency account. So is it that people compare the old statements to the new ones to infer this increased fluency, or, you know, I'm interested to hear whether you have any insights on that.
Yeah, so we always have both new and repeated statements in these studies. There is some evidence that when you compare kind of between subjects manipulations where everything's repeated versus within subjects where there's new and repeated, what you find is that the between subjects has a smaller effect. So having that comparison to new statements does seem to matter. but you don't seem to need much of it. So for some of our studies, we've used as few as 20 statements, so 10 new, 10 repeated, and you already see this difference. But yeah, so there's some evidence that you do need that comparison.
Great. So let's thank again Lisa for